All right, we're going to talk a little bit about abolition today. Abolition was the movement to end slavery in the United States, or if you will, to abolish slavery. The abolitionists included guys like Charles Finney, who was a Second Great Awakening preacher from New England, who forcefully advocated for an abolition of slavery. Other guys like William Lloyd Garrison, who weren't really preachers, didn't have a religious affiliation. Rather, William Lloyd Garrison became a newspaper publisher. This newspaper was dedicated to issues surrounding abolition. It was called The Liberator. And he was probably one of the more radical abolitionists, actually. He advocated for immediate release of all slaves with no economic compensation to slaveholders. This was a pretty radical position for his day. And he was almost obnoxious about how he advocated for it. Even a lot of abolitionists felt like he was a little bit over the top. And so didn't make a lot of friends. He was not a very popular guy, even amongst abolitionist circles. Other guys included like Frederick Douglass and Nat Turner. They were both freed slaves. Frederick Douglass, a slave who had been educated by his master's wife while living in the South. He had a skill. He was a shipbuilder, but he escapes and he goes to the North, where he begins publishing a newspaper himself. The name of the newspaper called the North Star, although he's generally considered a little bit more of a moderate abolitionist. And then another free slave, Nat Turner, and he's definitely more towards the radical end of things, and probably the most radical person we're talking about here today. Nat Turner advocates actually for open rebellion, and takes that and puts it into practice. He foments a slave rebellion in Virginia in 1831, in which approximately 200 people lose their lives, himself being one of them. He himself is captured and eventually hung for his role in leading the rebellion. And this really sparks a huge debate within Virginia itself. Should they or should they not legalize slavery? Uh, People in the East, in Eastern Virginia, felt like they should go ahead and keep slavery. And people in West Virginia were abolitionists. They didn't want to have slavery. And this will eventually lead to the split in the states, and it's why we have a state of Virginia and a state of West Virginia today. West Virginia was established by abolitionists. Conditions of a slave varied greatly depending upon where you lived. If you lived in rural areas, which is the majority of slaves, you probably lived in impoverished situations. The living conditions were pretty harsh. A lot of manual labor. When you hear about slaves being beaten, oftentimes it was in these rural settings. And they lived a pretty isolated life. But that was kind of the norm, not only for slaves, but for anybody who lived in the agricultural rural South. There was a lot of poverty. There were harsh manual labor was something that a lot of Southerners, and again, to farm is pretty hard labor, but a lot of Southerners had to deal with that. And till this day, people who live out in the country are isolated. What people think of when they think of the South is actually the plantation system. The plantation system, your large palatial homes with huge amounts of land and hundreds of slaves did exist in the South, although most slaves didn't exist in that system. Most slaves were actually owned by individuals who owned maybe one or two slaves and usually worked alongside of them. The plantation system, the plantations were a minority of slaveholders, but they were the largest, most visible segment of the slaveholding population. The other slave group were the urban slaves. These were your most valuable slaves. They were generally highly skilled. They were blacksmiths and carpenters, and they would be hired out by their masters for profit. These guys had a lot more freedom to move around. Obviously, they were being hired out, so they had to travel from home to home, from place to place to practice their skill. And these were the guys who, more often than not, ended up becoming the free slaves that advocated for abolition. They were the ones who had the means to escape. Most slaves who worked in the rural areas, they wouldn't even know which direction to go. It was the folks in the urban areas that would end up winning their freedom or escaping from slavery. So why did the people in the South say that slavery was okay? Well, they had a couple different lines of argument. The first was that slavery was in fact biblical, which is true. Slavery is in the Bible, and the Bible talks about slaves obeying their masters and things like that. And the Southerners were more than willing to bring these points up. Most Southerners were also willing to ignore other points about the master's responsibility to treat the slave appropriately, and every 7 years, slaves were to be set free in the year of Jubilee and things like that. But nonetheless, I mean, they have a very legitimate point that really, if you're looking at it, slavery is a biblical practice. The conditions of Northern workers was another big criticism the Southerners had. They had a criticism where, hey, you criticize us because of the conditions of our slaves. Look at the slums where your workers and your factories live. In many cases, the conditions are just as bad, if not worse, than what slaves would experience in the South. And further, in the South, if a slave became older or became sick, it was considered the responsibility of the master to care for that slave. The Northerners had no such responsibility. They just let those folks in the slums die, and they had no concern for caring for them after they were of useful, their working life, their useful working life was ended, and they were elderly. And so a lot of the Southerners said, "You Northerners are just hypocrites. You complain about the harshness of the life of a slave, but look at how your own workers are treated."